Welcome everyone to the Student Eco-Reps End of Year Forum. My name is Natalie Walker and I'm the Sustainability Manager with Penn Sustainability Office, located in the Division of Facilities and Real Estate Services. I'm joined by Andy Nyholm and Richard Ling, who will be assisting in moderating this forum. Andy and Richard serve as Student Eco-Rep coordinators and are responsible for managing and providing mentorship to the student eco-reps as they carry out their projects. As many of you know, Penn's Student Eco-Reps program is an environmental leadership program for students interested in advancing sustainability through implementing campus-based projects. Students work as paid employees of Penn's Sustainability Office and collaborate with university partners to carry out these projects in support of Penn's Climate and Sustainability Action Plan. This end-of-year forum is the culmination of all of the hard work that the students and their faculty and staff partners have done over the past academic year to further sustainability on campus. Each group has demonstrated remarkable ingenuity and flexibility both throughout the year and as they have adapted their project scopes and deliverables to successfully complete their projects remotely. We ask for your patience throughout this process as we will hear from presenters throughout the country and with varying levels of internet connectivity. Today, we will hear from 9 student eco-rep groups as they report on each of their project's progress. Topics range from waste and energy reduction to bird and lichen studies. Each group will be introduced by their project partner, and groups have about 7 minutes to speak and 3 minutes for questions directly following each presentation. We have a lot to cover today, so we'll be moving pretty quickly. This event will be recorded. All attendees will be muted for the duration of the forum. Please type any questions that you have for the group into the Q&A box as they come up for you. Andy Nyholm will relay all questions to the presenters after they have finished their presentation. If we're unable to answer all of your questions during the presentation today, we'll provide responses in the follow-up email. And with that, I'll turn it over to Alex Wagle to introduce his group, which is coming up first, the energy usage in Penn's high-rise buildings.
Hello, my name is Alex Wagle. I'm a researcher at the Center for Environmental Building and Design over at the Weston School of Design. And together with Dr. Bill Lamb, who is the director of the center, and Andrew Zaranow, who is the senior energy engineer at FRES, we have had the pleasure of working with 3 very intelligent students over the past year, all sophomores, Sophie Thorell, who majors in management and technology, Kaori Yoshida, who majors in computer science, and Christopher Fox, who majors in mechanical engineering with a minor in energy and sustainability. The project that they attempted this year was an effort to increase the awareness of energy consumption, focusing on the high-rises that students here on campus live in. I will allow them to explain the details of their project. However, I will say that they overcame quite a bit of difficulty given the fact that everybody left campus, and that slightly derailed their original plans. Their overall concept was to use energy information to drive sustainability with the idea that awareness of what students are consuming in the high-rises in their dorms might allow them to make better energy choices and lower their consumption, as well as potentially be useful in competitions, which might develop even greater savings as they competed with one another. So with that, I will hand it over to Sophie, Kaori, and Chris, and I look very much forward to hearing their results. Thank you.
Ready?
Yeah.
Everyone. So we are the Pennergy team. I'm Hiyori.
I'm Chris.
I'm Sophie.
And today we'll be presenting our project. So the problem that we wanted to address was the following. First, students pay a lump sum for rent and utilities on campus. Because of this, students do not know how much energy they consume. So this is why students living on campus are usually less energy conscious.
So we came into the year and our overall goal was to get students to reduce their energy usage by making them more energy conscious. We explored two approaches for this. The first was data-driven. So how can we actually use the data of energy usage in order to make students aware of how much they consume? And within that initiative, we had two ideas of implementation. The first was through visual dashboards to see this energy in a more digestible way. And the second was through these sustainability reports that could be sent to students. The second initiative that we wanted to explore was more stimulus-driven. So how can we tweak the environment in order to make students living in the high-rises save energy in easier ways? So the first implementation that we wanted to get on the ground was to have stickers next to light switches and AC units to remind students to be mindful of how much they use. And the second is actually to use that implementation and to use the data to see how effective that implementation was in changing behavior in the short term, but also in the long term. So we kind of split this year-long project as part research and part talking to people within the Penn network. So the first is we conducted research about what other institutions had done, and there's more details about this in our paper. But just to keep it short, we found that competition really helps for student participation, and they always nearly lead to at least a short-term energy saving in dorms. And the most effective competitions are the ones that have an incentive for students to join. The second is that quantitative information is effective. So, there's been a lot of research to see how making people more aware of this information triggers a want to change their behavior. And the last factor that we explored is actually the importance of regular feedback. And this is because it's really helpful to get students to know how much they are doing, but also how much people around them are changing behavior, because social approval and the sense of belonging are really important psychological motives about why people change their behavior. So to conclude from our research findings, we need to come up with a solution that has tangible incentives, digestible data, and regular feedback on students' progress towards having a more energy efficient lifestyle. I'll pass it on to Hiyori. He's going to talk more about the timeline that we have, done in talking to the people within Penn's network.
Thanks. So I'll go over a summary of who we met this semester and what we learned. So early on last semester, we met with Alex Wagle, our project partner, and we brainstormed initial ideas for our project. After meeting with Alex, we met with Andrew Zaranow, who is the energy planning engineer at FRES. He gave us historic energy usage data for Harrison and is currently working with FRES leadership Zoco dashboard, which gave us a vision for our dashboard idea. Then we met with David Dunn, who is the senior project manager for the FRES Department of Design and Construction, and he made us realize that there is no direct energy metering for individual rooms. After meeting with David, we met with Bill Bram, who is the professor and director at Center for Environmental Building and Design at Penn, and along with the meeting with David, this is when we realized we needed to change our focus from individual to per building data usage, energy usage. Early on this semester, we met with Calixa and Abby, who are both part of the Climate Reality Project at Penn. And because we shared similar goals for our projects, we agreed to collaborate and we discussed sustainability reports for students. Finally, right before spring break, we met with Frank Pelicone, who is the Harrison College House Dean, Jennifer Hook, who is the House Coordinator for Harrison, Max Reyes, who is the Building Administrator for the high-rises, and John Macri, who is the Residential Services Manager. And with them, we discussed our idea of putting up stickers in public spaces in the high-rises to encourage students to turn off their lights, and the idea of using the display in Harrison Mezzanine as a way to showcase our dashboard.
So the easiest way to do this implementation relatively quickly was to do stickers. So basically, we were planning on putting 3 stickers in each of the high-rise communal lounges. So basically, one of them would be focused on turning off lights, one of them would be focused on closing windows when the heater, the AC is on, and one is focused on lowering the thermostat. Then we also wanted to implement a website that would be accessible from the QR code on the stickers. And basically, this website would let students easily access some data on energy usage in the high rises. So on the next slide, you can see that we wanted to give students the information of the estimated cost they would be having to pay for their energy usage if they lived off campus. Also comparing their energy usage to Philadelphia residents, dorms at other colleges, and also looking at how this energy usage would kind of look if it was used only by like flat screen TVs or something, making it a little more digestible and understanding.
Yeah, so just to conclude, we have taken this year to talk to a lot of stakeholders across the Penn's network of who monitors the energy, and what we've learned is that the systems are very complex. There are very few people at FRES who actually have access to this data, and we're working with them to actually get them to grant permission to share this data. The next is about the actual difficulty of getting students to change their behavior, and this requires, as we've explored before, a lot of planning, regular feedback, some form of incentive, and a good digestible representation of the data. And so the next step will be to work on several stakeholders about their proposals, obtain the energy data and populate the dashboard, and launch some kind of campaign or competition between the high rises, as this will motivate students to actually be involved in this movement to reduce their energy usage on campus. Thank you very much, and we're open to any questions that anyone has.
Okay, thank you, Penergy. So if anyone in the audience has any questions, feel free to put it in the Q&A section of the poll. You should see it on your screen. Please feel free to put in any questions, and we'll post those to the audience or to the presenters. And if there's a delay right now, that is fine. There is a delay in the Blue Jeans announcement itself. First question from Ramiro. What success have you found that other universities have?
Sophie, do you want to take this?
Yeah, I can answer this one because I've done the research on this, and there'll be more on this in our paper. But essentially, I was looking at universities such as Vanderbilt have had quite high success in launching competitions in dorms, as well as Stanford. What other universities have done is also implemented low-cost sensors in dorms, which allows to have sort of more real-time, but also individual level data. However, the approach that we've taken is we want to take a more behavioral approach to this problem. So another study that I looked at was it was a review of 38 studies of household energy use conducted over the past 25 years across the US. And this kind of showed what the relationship between people and their energy users had. And that's where we got findings that getting regular feedback on how much they consume relative to others is really important.
Feel free to just keep on posting questions. We're waiting for another one. Also, during the presentation itself, feel free to post at any point. I'll just make notes of them as we go forward. Not a question, but just a comment. Nice presentation, guys.
Thanks.
From
Yeah, we
Jersey.
can see the questions as well. I don't know if everyone else can though in the audience.
Oh, here's a question from Avni. How do you think you can make this campaign more visible so that more students even know that this data is potentially accessible to them?
I mean, I think it's mainly about just kind of getting the stickers implemented, and then, basically anyone who's in the high rises should be able to see these, and if they're interested in it, they'll, scan the QR code and learn more. And then ideally we would try to roll that out into like all the college houses as well. Maybe put some stuff on social media about where you can find this information. Because there is some information that's already kind of readily available to students, but it's generally kind of difficult to digest and also kind of hidden away. So we kind of want to make it as easy for students to really understand their energy usage as possible.
Another question from Anonymous. Comparatively, have you found that university students do use more electricity?
I'm guessing this question is asking relative to when they live off campus. I haven't found specifically an experiment that compares on campus and off campus. However, doing research on what other universities have done, the universities themselves have commented on very high energy usage on dorms, and it has been a problem across campuses to tackle this. So I think it is fair to say that because the incentive of saving costs is not there as much, I think students in general are less conscientious about how much they use.
Yeah, I think if you were looking at like a direct like kilowatt hour comparison, it'd be a little hard to do just because of dorms are generally a lot smaller, and you have a lot of like communal things as well, compared to someone living in an off-campus house. But I think there's definitely a lot of waste energy that we were really trying to address, and try to get students to lower.
Correct me if I'm, so that's the end of that question. So I believe that we're kind of reaching the end of the 3-minute time period. Richard, correct me if I'm wrong. If so, I think we could probably move on to the next group, unless your group has any more comments to say.
I don't think so.
Okay, well, thank you very
Thanks
much.
for listening.
Thank you.
So I believe that the next presentation is on the lichen as bioindicators, and we'll have Nam introduce themselves.
Yeah, so I'll start. My name's Weston, and I worked with Abby and Nicole, and we did the lichen audit at Penn Park. So, going through on the next slide, product objective and key stakeholders. Hopefully you guys can see that. If you can't, I'm just going to read it because I don't see it. So our goal was to assess the variety of lichen species found in Penn Park and analyze them as bioindicators of air quality. As I'll explain a little bit later, lichen provide themselves as like great indicators of air quality for specific reasons. I'll get more into that once I look at our literature, which is the first step in our project. So we worked with Sam Royer at Frez, along with Natalie Howe and Christopher Lynn at Engineers Without Borders, we were hoping to use Engineers Without Borders to kind of confirm our findings that or confirm like the air quality statistics that we found by just analyzing the lichen to make sure that the correlation was correct, if you will. So if we found a bunch of crusty lichen, which are generally indicators of bad air quality, we could test for that and like confirm our finding. Moving on to the next slide, just a little bit about lichen. They're symbiotic organisms. They're fungus and bacteria together. And their biology allows them to identify specific toxins, which I'll talk about in the next slide. So if you go to the next slide. Here, looking at our literature review, which was the first part of our project. We specifically looked at 3 different studies, one from National Park Service. The first at the National Park Service kind of really told us, and it tipped us off about what our findings should look at. If you see at the bottom point, it says that it found that urban parks near DC had no sensitive lichen species. Sensitive lichen species being bushy or leafy lichen, which I think Nicole or Abby will talk about a little later. So that kind of tipped us off that we should be looking for more crusty lichen, or that should be what we're seeing in an urban park such as Penn Park. The second really tipped us off about they kind of only exchange, they absorb from the atmosphere only. They don't necessarily absorb from their root system, considering they don't necessarily have one. They're just kind of stuck on trees or at the root of the tree, or maybe on rocks, etc. This makes them especially good indicators, considering we're testing air quality. The next study also showed us that told us that they exchange gases and solutions freely, and they're also slow to like repair themselves if they absorb like a damaging toxin, such as like sulfur dioxide or nitrous oxide or etc. So that also makes them good indicators of air quality, and that's kind of how we prepared ourselves to understand our findings through our project. And now I'll pass it off to Abby.
Yeah, you can go to the next slide, Natalie. So essentially, we did most of our work, obviously, in Penn Park. So for those of you who aren't as familiar, it's obviously a really large plant space on the east end of Penn's campus. There's a variety of plant life there, as well as just a bunch of grassy areas and areas for pedestrians. So it's a really good place, obviously, to look at all of the biodiversity of plants that Penn has. So that's the first place where we did some of our work. You can go to the second slide. The next place where we had a plot where we analyzed lichen was in the geology garden. So this is a little area right by Hayden Hall. So we used a plot here just almost as like a control group, just to see how the air quality would differ based on the fact that there's a lot more just foot traffic in that area. So you can go to the next slide. Just for our methodology, it was fairly simple based on what we saw on the literature reviews that we looked at the start of the project. So for methodology, this is the next slide, Natalie. Thank you. We essentially did something called quadrant sampling, which is a really standard procedure. You can back it up. It's a really standard procedure used in studies like this. So essentially, we just created a square surface area of trees that we saw visible lichen on, and then next, as you can see, we took various magnified photos of different magnifications of all of the lichen we saw on these trees, and then we went to self-identify them. We wanted to use iNaturalist at first, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's essentially like an online software that allows you to post pictures of plant life or animals or any sort of species that you want identified or that you need more information on, and then people who are experts or just in kind of the environmental community can go and identify what you posted. We unfortunately didn't get that much success with trying to use iNaturalist. Mostly people were just identifying what we put as like moss or fungi or something like that, so it was kind of difficult. So then we ended up self-identifying. And then if you go to the next slide, Natalie, that just gives you a little bit more detail on exactly what we did for our field sampling. So our plots were 25 feet by 25 feet. We had 2 in Penn Park and 1 in the geology garden. And I can pass it up to Nicole now.
Okay, so now just moving to the next slide, these are just some sample field photos that we took. So we took photos of the plots themselves, and then using the wide angle lenses, we took photos of the lichen on the trees. And then moving on to the next slide, you can kind of see a bit more about how those photos were classified using this lichen classification system. So these are the main types of growing forms of lichen. So it's crustose, foliose, or fruticose. And so these kind of represent either crushy, bushy, or leafy lichen. And so we just compared these photos with these specific morphologies. And so now just looking at our key results on the next slide. Altogether, we took 87 photos, but it's pretty significant that about 1/3 of them were unidentifiable. And this was just because we were doing this with the natural eye and using these guides. But we did find that there was the greatest proportion of crustose lichen, around 60% actually. And then the most common species found was the Lepraria incana species. And this species is a crustose type of lichen, and it is indicative of poor air quality, but it's not a super sensitive lichen species. And so now just going on to our final slide. Our study, we would have hoped that our study could have included air quality measurements. However, it was cut short given the semester, but we would strongly recommend that anybody continuing this work just consider conducting air quality measurements, specifically of sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide. We would also recommend doing laboratory analysis of lichen and understanding their microbiology to make sure that the specific species are identified. And this can also entail working with additional researchers and networks. We would also strongly recommend working with Engineers Without Borders if possible. Yes, and so yeah, just to the last slide. We just want to thank Sam, who's our main project partner, Natalie, Richard, Andy, and all the Iker reps for their support, and we can take any questions.
Good. Thank you, group. I meant to have, and I apologize for this, I meant to have Sam Royer introduce this team and give a couple words. So Sam, if you want to say something now, when we're waiting for some more questions to appear, please feel free.
Okay, great. Thanks, Andy. Can everybody hear me? Can everybody hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to say thanks to the team for all their hard work, especially with the semester. So everybody had introduced themselves. I guess doing that part of it as you saw already. So I just want to say thank you for all your hard work, and hopefully that you guys got something out of it as well as everybody else, and definitely for me. So I look forward to looking at all your research in a little bit more depth. Once everything's done here today, and just want to say thank you on behalf of Frez for everything you did. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam.
Okay, we're still waiting for some questions to roll in. But in the meantime, could so each person in the team maybe say something that they found surprising about their project so far? Such as with the identification.
I guess I can start. I found it really surprising how hard it would be to do these types of identifications ourselves, just using these guides and things, because there is such a large margin of error in doing this.
Yeah, and kind of with that, it was kind of not necessarily surprising, but interesting to see exactly where how the lichen dispersed itself, because you could have one tree that had lichen covering it from the first 5 feet of the trunk, and then the tree next to it might have no lichen, and that just kind of gave us kind of tipped us off about how important maybe the tree species in general was, and we would have liked to do more work with which tree species were most popular for lichen to be on and why, but we never really got to that point of the experiment just because the whole virus thing, but I thought that was pretty interesting to see.
Yeah, I guess just adding to that, yeah, I totally agree with what Nicole said, especially about like it was a little bit difficult to just identify the lichen. I think we were just kind of expecting that as soon as we put something on iNaturalist, we would just have like results flowing in. But I guess that just kind of shows you like how much detail you need when you're trying to identify plant species that are as sensitive as lichen, and especially a lot of them just look like each other, or you can have a certain amount of lichen on a tree and it can actually be like 10 different species, and unless you take a magnified photo at like 10 or 30 times or what have you, you're not going to be able to tell. So I think that's something we especially learned, like how to properly or better use iNaturalist. You definitely need to give a little bit more detail so you don't have a misidentification.
Okay, thank you. So we are actually running a little short on time. So if anyone has any follow-up questions, feel free to still put it in the chat and we'll answer them at a later point. But I believe we're going to move on to the next team. Thank you, Lichen team. Now could we have Joe Gaither introduce his team from the Housekeeping Sustainability Training Project?
Hello? Hello?
Hello, we can hear you.
Hello? Oh, you can. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Joe Gaither. I'm the operations manager of this year was with Project. Last year we worked with Chris Fox and Hayuri Yoshida. And ours is really to develop a sustainability training for our housekeeping team. Our housekeeping team consists of 500 housekeepers. They touch literally every office and every surface on campus. So the thought is if we can better educate them to sustainability, that they'd be good ambassadors for us kind of out in the field and in the Penn community. So this year we worked with Marina and Catherine. They updated the training. They did a really good job. They updated to include like a game show, an interactive quiz. And I got to say there was a very high level of engagement from our housekeeping staff. And it can be very difficult sometimes to get in front of them and present something like this. So this year, the goal was to train all 500 housekeepers. And I would say that Catherine and Marina went after it very aggressively. It's unfortunate we had a break in the schedule this year because I do think they would have got that done. To date, we've trained a little over 200 housekeepers and close to 90% of our third shift, which is very difficult. I can't stress enough how hard it is to get students to roll in the door at 6 o'clock in the morning and present and be cheerful and engaged with a large group of housekeepers. So unfortunately, Catherine's in New Zealand, so she won't be joining us today. However, Marina Dower's here. She's a major in environmental services and political science, and she's going to be presenting for us. Anybody still there?
Thank you for that introduction. So I'm Marina, and I have worked on the housekeeping sustainability team this past year. So just to dive in, some of our goals for the project, really our main objectives were first to design our presentation and our new version of the presentation, really with the housekeepers' feedback in mind. We did a number of focus groups to get perspectives on the previous year's presentation, as well as what people would like to see added or changed, and really made sure that we were coming back to that as we were creating our presentation. And throughout the year, even after we had started presenting, we still made changes based on the feedback we were getting, and we just made sure to always keep that sort of top of mind. Our second goal was to educate housekeeping staff both about global environmental issues, as well as more specifically about sustainable housekeeping efforts at Penn. Third, we wanted to make sure that through our presentation, we created a space for conversation and to share issues in an inclusive and welcoming way. So when we were talking about these huge global environmental issues, we made sure that we were making personal connections, like talking about what this could mean for someone's children or grandchildren, as well as mentioning things like local activism efforts in the Philly area, so that people would be engaged and see the effect that this could have on their everyday life. And finally, we wanted to measure the impact of our presentations using pre and post surveys, and I'll share some of the results from those later. We were lucky to have wonderful project partners in Joe, James, and Wendy. So thank you all for your help throughout this year. So our presentation covered a number of different topics. The first section was giving context to, as I mentioned, global environmental issues, namely climate change and its different effects. So you can see some photos from these slides on the right. And we also shared information about Penn's new Climate and Sustainability Action Plan, because through focus groups, we found that essentially none of the housekeeping staff were aware of this plan, so we wanted to make sure that we shared that information with them. We also added an interactive activity, sort of in the form of a game show, and we did give out prizes to the winning team during each presentation. Those prizes were reusable straws, just to sort of stay on theme with our presentation. And the reason we did this was to make sure people were staying engaged, to check understanding of the first section of the presentation, and to preview material from the upcoming sections. Of course, the meat of our presentation was information about sustainable products and practices at Penn Housekeeping, and the final section were some takeaways and sharing strategies for housekeeping staff to bring sustainable practices home with them. So here are just a couple sample slides from our presentation. You can see that it's covering everything from background about climate change and sharing results of the IPCC report, information specifically about how the Climate and Sustainability Action Plan includes housekeepers and their sustainability efforts, showing how housekeepers' day-to-day actions can contribute to sustainability, as well as strategies to be sustainable at home. And this slide gives an example of using eco-friendly cleaning products. So now to share some results from the pre and post surveys that we did. So the goal with these was to have every single housekeeping staff member that attended our presentation do a survey right at the beginning and then after they'd seen it to measure incoming knowledge and attitudes as well as learning. So we can see here in the pre-survey that the largest percentage of people are rating themselves sort of middling knowledge about sustainability in general, and the same for knowledge about sustainability efforts at Penn Housekeeping. But then moving on to the next slide, in the post-survey, we can see that those percentages shifted significantly, with the most people rating themselves as a 5, so very knowledgeable about both sustainability in general and at Penn Housekeeping. So this does show a significant shift. And of course, learnings from directly after seeing a presentation don't necessarily represent learnings that you'll carry with you for a long time. But these results were great to see and showed us that people were gaining knowledge and information through our sustainability training. And for the next slide, so in our pre and post surveys, we wanted to not only ask sort of sliding scale questions, but also go a little bit more in depth to see in the pre-survey if housekeepers could identify any housekeeping sustainability efforts or identify environmental problems in the world. And we did a similar thing with our post-survey. So one question we asked in the post-survey was, what is one thing you will share with a friend or family member about this presentation? The reason we wanted to ask this was not only to get the exact answer, but also to sort of implant in people's minds that it is really critical to share this information and spread it throughout our communities. So you can see here that we got some answers like the importance of creating a better world for a future generation, telling friends that this is a serious matter and small steps can add up, and that sustainability is a large problem, much more than just recycling and composting. So again, these results were great to see and showed the impact and learning through our presentation. If we can move on to the next slide. I'm sorry, could we move on to the next slide? So our takeaways from this project, sorry, I think my computer was lagging, but essentially our takeaways from this project were that housekeepers were very receptive to the information and asked a lot of insightful questions, so that was definitely a great thing to see. We used introductions and an icebreaker to set a positive tone in each session, and the activity, the game, interactive activity was very well received and is definitely something that I would recommend for any future projects containing presentations. We do need to find a way to make sure the surveys get out efficiently and plan better for some issues with technology, such as people's phones not being able to connect to the surveys so that we can make sure that we're not missing any participants. Another area for improvement is that we got frequent questions about students acting unsustainably and essentially housekeepers wanting to know if there is any action being taken on that. So that is a possible idea for a future project. So thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions about this project.
Okay. Thank you, Marina. Yet again, please feel free to put in any questions that you have in the chat bar at any point during the presentation. We'll just save them to the end. We have one from Simon Richter here saying, great project and presentation. Do you have the sense that housekeepers felt empowered through the program? Were there opportunities for them to suggest ways to contribute to campus sustainability?
That's a really great question. We definitely did try to give housekeepers lots of information about how their day-to-day actions were helping to meet the goals of the Climate and Sustainability Action Plan. So I do think that that could empower them to understand how they're helping meet these goals. And we also gave them lots of strategies for acting sustainably outside of work, at home, with things like carpooling, using more reusable items, saving energy, things like that. And in the post survey, there were some opportunities to suggest topics that be added or future projects, and we also took questions during and after every training.
The next question is there a plan to institutionalize this type of training so new staff members get this information as they start working?
So as Joe mentioned, our goal was to train every member of the housekeeping staff, so that would have covered everyone, from people who've been there for 40 years to people who just started working, because regardless of their time with Penn Housekeeping, since these practices, especially in sustainability, change over time, it's important to sort of train and reconnect with people on that. I don't know of any specific sustainability training. Joe, do you want to jump in on this?
So that's a really good point. The first thing I'd see in a feedback focus groups with the housekeepers, Wendy and I, she's the director. And since we've done these trainings, sustainability has come up quite a bit, so that's been very encouraging. That's a really good point. The question they just asked, we should set this up. I think the training is very good. So we do have a pretty good onboarding program. So maybe we'll make this training part of that. Like maybe we'll cut some of the stuff out of it and focus on the basics and include it with the onboard training. It's a really good point.
Okay. So that was all great, Marina. We're going to move on. Feel free to message us your responses to the questions in the chat and we'll post them later. But moving on, we have Penn Design, a composting pilot program, and we'll have Carl Wellman introduce his group. Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon. I hope you're all safe and well at this time. My name is Carl Wellman. I'm Senior Director for Operations and Planning as well as Design and Construction at the Weston School of Design. We're also joined by Sandy Moscow, who is the Building Administrator. We were fortunate enough to partner with two amazing students and eco reps, Hope Liu as well as Johanna Inamagua. Hope is a senior and is the Life Sciences and Management program studying biology and finance. Johanna is a junior majoring biology. Together we piloted a compost project within Meyerson Hall as well as recycling of pens, pencils, and markers. Meyerson Hall houses a large number of students using dedicated studio spaces as well as central pool classrooms, administrative offices, and a cafe. Many of our faculty, staff, and students are interested in composting. We thought this would be a great opportunity to introduce composting on site and also educate some occupants. While the evacuation of personnel on campus has affected the study, we're proud of the work of Johanna and Hope and look forward to continuing with the compost program once campus operations return to normal. With that, I will now ask Hope and Johanna to speak about the project.
Thank you, Carl. Okay, so as he mentioned, Sandy Moscow and Carl were the ones who started this project. They identified that there was a need for a composting pilot in the design cafe because they had heard from design students who were interested in having those services available. So the image that you see on the bottom there, it's an image of what the cafe looks like when it's all packed up, when everything's put away, but typically the cafe serves food and beverages and stuff like that. And so during our meeting, Sandy, Carl, Hope, and I came up with a breakdown of the project into a part that would be researching the different hauler options, implementing the pilot, and then assessing the use of it at the cafe. And then Hope can go on the next slide to explain more.
Great. So basically, for the majority of the fall semester, we really focused on the first part that Joanna mentioned, where we wanted to assess the different options for compost collection. The three main metrics we used to evaluate the options were pricing, convenience, and the types of items that were accepted by the composter. And because this is just a pilot program, we decided that smaller scale composting services would be more appropriate. So we looked into three different services: Bennett Compost, Kitchen Harvest, and Circle Compost. And we basically created a table to evaluate them side by side. And our final recommendation to both Sandy and Carl was to use Bennett Composting. So primarily because the pricing across the three services is the same. And the type of service is where we use a 5-gallon bucket, and basically there are weekly pickups where the composting service comes over and collects the waste from us. And the reason why we decided to go with Bennett was because previous pilot programs, such as the ones at Harrison or Wolf Humanities, have used Bennett before, and also they accepted a few more items like dairy and soiled cardboard and newspaper that we thought students would be interested in composting. Next slide, please. So another thing that we wanted to briefly mention that Carl talked about was we also introduced writing instrument recycling. Basically, we were able to cover the cost of an initial box that the design school used, and we partnered with this company called TerraCycle, and they basically collect pens and pen caps and mechanical pencils, and we got this idea from a student, so that has also been implemented, and we hope that the design school continues with it.
Okay, so once the composting pilot began with Bennett Compost in January, Hope and I wanted to work on advertising the program and kind of letting everyone know that it existed. So the first thing that we did was have a casual event around lunchtime during the Friday afternoon, and we just stood in the cafe and we passed out brownies in the space to let them know that the pilot had begun. So we also told them where the buckets were located, what items we could accept, and then also gave them the opportunity to ask us any questions. We also put up flyers all around the basement and labeled the buckets with them. You see some example images on the left. So they basically just kind of let you know what organic items Bennett does accept and what can go into the buckets. And we placed them around the entrances of the building so that if you weren't directly in the cafe, you could still know that this was available at Meyerson. And then lastly, Sandy and Carl helped us to advertise the pilot at a happy hour social event that's held for the design students and staff. So the event is mainly social for the attendees, but we had the opportunity to make an announcement over the microphone about the pilot and share again similar information about how the buckets are used, what we can accept, and the fact that meat and non-food products aren't accepted. Next slide.
Great. So another thing that we did in addition to advertising the Compost Pilot program was we actually conducted an initial waste audit. Basically, we evaluated all the bins in the Meyerson basement, including the recycling, food, and trash. And basically, we sorted it out and measured it by weight. And we were interested in seeing what percentage of the waste stream is actually food. And we found that almost half of the total weight of waste generated in the basement is food, which is great because that means that there's definitely use of a composting program in this particular location. And we were also interested in a few other metrics. We found that the contamination of the recycling bins was around 30%, which means that by weight, this is the amount of the waste that is misplaced into the recycling bins. We also found that the real recycling rate was around 7%, with the potential recycling rate around 11%, which just means that there are more recyclable items that could have been disposed of in the recycling bins. And so we weren't able to conduct a second waste audit due to the transition to a virtual setting, but we still think that this data might be helpful to revisit if the design school and Meyerson continues to run the program on a larger scale. Next slide, please. So then another thing that we wanted to showcase were the results of the composting pilot program. Basically, in this slide, in the green box, you can see that there is particularly heavy usage of the bins in the first and second week of the program. And then afterwards, in the blue boxes, we can also see that certain buckets in specific locations are much more heavily used. Great. And basically what we found was that the buckets that are placed near high foot traffic, as close as possible to the cafe or near waste disposal areas, tended to be the most used by students. And so longer term data would definitely show more meaningful trends, but at least from what we have, we can see that the bins are being used by students, even though it varies from a week to week basis. But there is significant demand from the students and faculty that use this building. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so we also had the opportunity to get some feedback throughout doing this, either directly to the Eco reps or to Carl and Sandy. So we heard that it was a little inconvenient to use. So our recommendation for that would be to raise the buckets closer to eye level so it's easier. You don't have to bend down as much to use them. We also had some complaints about smell. And when we contacted Bennett Compost, we heard this was normal and to be expected, but we could add newspaper to reduce moisture in the samples. We've also heard that people wish they could compost meat. And so we suggest that if this were to be expanded and the pilot would continue, you could continue to use it organic diversion or biobin, which are two companies that do accept meat. Next slide. I think that it would be useful to continue assessing the use of the buckets by measuring weight. And the pilot could be expanded or just continued to run at the cafe. Of course, this would happen when the building itself returns to normal occupancy and normal functioning. We also recommend that the placement of the buckets stay consistent and hopefully near other waste receptacles so that there's greater visibility and hopefully more consistent use. And then lastly, during the past week, Hope and I were working on a general guide to starting composting pilots on campus. So this would direct others who might be interested in starting similar projects in the future. and Penn Sustainability will review the guide, which is posted on the right on that slide. So hopefully the information can be made accessible to more Penn community members and who also see the value of adding composting services to their building or business waste streams. But that's the end of our presentation. Thank you for listening. Thank you to Sandy and Carl for working with us this semester. And if you have any questions, we'd really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you, group. We're running a little behind on schedule, so if there's one quick question, I think we could take it. Otherwise, we can probably just move ahead, if that's all right. Please post your questions in the engagement. Oh, very quick question. Where were the buckets placed? Was it far from the regular waste bins or next to them?
Great question. We had multiple bins. So some of the buckets were placed next to regular waste bins. Other bins were placed by the classrooms in the basement, and other bins were placed right next to the cafe itself.
Okay. So unfortunately, we don't have time to answer any more questions. Please still feel free to put questions in the chat. But moving on, thank you, team. And the next team is going to be about ECREPS and the plan, Students for Zero Waste conference from 2019. And I believe Ramiro can introduce his team if he's able to talk. Okay, I think we're having a little trouble getting him to get promoted from an attendee to a presenter, unless this is him. Oh no, this is Maggie. So Maggie will just talk about her team. She's been working with Plan for Students for Zero Waste, and she could probably talk about the program much better than I can. So Maggie, do you want to take this away?
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I'm Maggie, and I worked on the Plan Students for Zero Waste 19 registration and post-conference survey data with Livy Fielding, who was studying abroad this semester. So this actually took place last fall, from October 11th to 13th, 2019. Could you go to the next slide, please? So the next slide talks a little bit about, I'll just mention a little bit of the background. So Post Landfill Action Network, or PLAN, is a nonprofit that really works with students to inspire them to be a part of the student-led zero waste movement. And every year they hold a Students for Zero Waste SCW conference, which brings together students, staff, industry innovators, activists, and community members from across the country to train and educate attendees on topics related to waste and environmental justice. And the SCW survey data project was one of the projects that really culminated from the first year partnership between PLAN this year and EcoReps. So the goal really was to evaluate key metrics such as ticket sales, organization and location tracking, demographics, price paid, and other variables that measure people's satisfaction with the conference, to compare the data of those who attended the conference with those who did not attend. And the survey also included a section for volunteers, as well as housing and general feedback. And we hope that from the survey, we could begin to measure the changes in these variables from year to year. So this was actually the second year that this survey was sent out. And yeah, I also worked with Ramiro, Kayla, and Faye, and they were our project mentors. Next slide, please. So our data was comprised of, one, the pre-conference registration data, which was automatically generated when participants registered for the conference, and two, the post-conference survey data in the form of a Google form that was sent out to attendees. And the presentation will be split into two parts based on these separate data sets. And just as a disclaimer, our sample size was very small, with only about 71 attendees responding out of the 332 who attended the conference, which translates to roughly a 21% response rate. So all of the conclusions that are drawn from this survey must be taken with a grain of salt. So just as a disclaimer. Next slide, please. So the registration data was gathered from Eventbrite, and it was prior to the conference that this data was gathered. It was about ticket sales, price paid for tickets, state and location tracking, interest in zero waste topics, demographics, and age were tracked. And then we split up the data of all those who registered for the conference, which was 388 people, into one, those who attended, which were 332 people, and two, those who did not attend, which were 56 people. And again, sample size does matter. So again, all conclusions must be drawn with the result. Next slide, please. So in terms of findings, we can start with ticket sales. We found that ticket sales were actually most popular in the middle of the week on Tuesday and Wednesday, and particularly on Fridays. And peak sales occurred between the beginning of September to the beginning of October, with one progression during the first 2 weeks of September and peaking at the middle of September, and a second lower progression in the week of September to the first week of October. And these, I think, correlate with when we sent out the emails to remind people to register. Next slide. So then after that, we looked at the price paid for tickets, and we found that non-attendees were actually more likely to have been subsidized by 100% and less likely to have been subsidized during early bird sales than attendees. And 50% of non-attendees were subsidized by 100% to only like 28% of total registered. So this might suggest that non-attendees registered later than sooner, and non-attendees may also have received codes from their organization leader in order to be subsidized. So that was just a pattern that we found. Next slide, please. And then in terms of topic of interest, we found that those who registered expressed the most interest in the intersectionality of the zero waste movement, as well as getting to know the environmental justice movement as a whole. And topics with the least amount of interest were more niche, such as environmental programs and business development. Next slide. Then we took a look at demographics. And we found that non-attendees were actually nearly twice as likely to identify as a person of color, low income, or directly affected by waste infrastructure than those who attend. And in terms of age, non-attendees were less likely to be between the ages of 18 to 22 and more likely to be older in the categories of 23 to 26 or over 26, which makes sense because this conference is catered towards college-age students. And then next slide, we'll be moving on to the post-conference survey data. So this data is based on the survey that was sent out to attendees after the conference, and reminders were sent out every week after that, and it tracked variables such as registration, food, sessions, navigability, demographics, and housing. Next slide. So in terms of registration, more people actually agreed that registration was really easy to use compared to last year. Most people rated it from a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 or 4. And people also felt that the conference was well within their budget, and that gave us the idea that most people were very overall satisfied with the value of the conference. Next slide. And then in terms of attendee demographics, the top 5 most commonly cited demographics were people of color, queer, none of the above, first generation college student, and low income. So it does seem like the conference does cater towards a very diverse group of people. And next slide. Then we took a look at specific impact variables, which were housing, food, and just overall experience with the conference scheduling. We found that these are basically just the metrics that we compared with the year previous. And we found that most of the ratings stayed around the same or improved or dropped a little bit, but most of all stayed the same. People were relatively happy with the registration process and food. And I think the only that was really of concern was the scheduling of the conference, because people did tend to want to move around a lot, but didn't get to see get to attend the talks that they wanted to. So next slide, some recommendations for future projects. I think in terms of being statistically significant. Because our sample size was really small, it was very hard to be able to draw, statistically significant results from the survey. So in order to increase the number of responses, I feel that plan should put in some sort of incentive system to encourage more responses, as well as shorten the survey so that it is a bit shorter, and split up questions from the registration form to the survey or vice versa. And last slide. Thank you, a huge thank you to Ramiro, Kayla, and Faye, and the whole team for bringing me and Livy on board. I think because we were working on the survey, we really felt that it was apparent that Plan really cares about feedback and improving as an organization, and it was really cool just to see how an eco organization works. And we look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Maggie. So unfortunately, we're pretty behind schedule, so we're going to skip questions right now. Please still post your questions. We'll answer them later, but unfortunately, we still have to move on. So our next group is on the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities, and our presenter will be Bethany Wicken, a professor here. I can't hear you right now. 1 second.
Let's do a sound check. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks so much for having me. I am the faculty director of the academic program, Penn Program in Environmental Humanities, which is in the School of Arts and Sciences. The 3 students who have been working with us as eco-reps this semester have a lot to say to you about the fantastic work they've been doing. Anna and Brandon and Greg are part of a team of 6 public research interns who've been working on this project, climate finance and public research about that. It's our first time collaborating with the Wharton School, and we've been really delighted to do so. They'll tell you more about the ins and outs of the project. I just wanted to set the stage for you slightly about the program and what we do. We'd love to have eco-reps work with us in the future. We have a program called Public Research Interns. We're running 2 public research interns cohorts this year. Anna, Brandon, and Greg are part of the climate finance team, and we have a team of 12 climate storytellers who we also run. The students do fantastic work. It's made publicly available. If you'd like to find out more about the program's core commitments and ways that you can get involved, please feel free to reach out to me, check out our website. As you'll see from Anna, Brandon, and Greg's presentation, students themselves are also very active on social media, talking about the work that we do, and we do a lot of public writing. I'll hand it over to Anna, Brandon, and Greg with a final word of thanks to Penn Sustainability for making this possible.
Great. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Great. Okay. So we're just going to start with our mission statement. Thank you for the introduction, Bethany. This is what our group came up with towards the beginning of our project, is to talk about the goals, our individual goals, our group goals, and what we wanted to get out of this project at the end of the year. So we work with PPEH and the Total Impact Portfolio Challenge, which is part of the Wharton Social Impact Initiative. And our goals were to document the human faces of climate finance, highlight the experiences of the TIPC contestants who hail from over 40 colleges and universities across the country, and to explore the power of climate finance when strategizing climate solutions. So we'll hear more about the TIPC later on, but basically this year the challenge was to invest a fictional college's endowment in driving climate solutions. And our overall goal was to make this challenge, as well as climate finance more broadly, digestible and approachable using our website and our social media on Instagram and Twitter.
Okay, so this next slide details what exactly is climate finance. Essentially, historically, large-scale environmental progress is often thought of in terms of government and specific technological innovations. However, climate finance is an idea that seeks to get perhaps the most powerful movers of progress in our society, the private sector, private companies, in on the action of pushing for environmentalism and helping to push forward these green initiatives, especially in terms of like finance and capital backing. But the term climate finance was originated an idea that the wealthier global north should financially support developing countries in the global south. And this idea originated from UN climate negotiations, where these wealthier countries would essentially support the renewable development of developing countries so that they don't have to use fossil fuels as many developed countries already have. But however, nowadays this term has become much more broad. It refers to the financial demand for climate adaptation and mitigation projects, and this includes initiatives such as the New York seawall, which is being thought of to hold back higher seas. And then additionally, a large part of climate finance, the part that we've mainly focused on, is it's using capital from climate-friendly investments. Next slide. So a large part of this project was going to be keeping track and blogging about Wharton's Total Impact Portfolio Challenge. As Anna said, this is part of Wharton's Social Impact Initiative. And essentially, this is a nationwide competition in which teams of both MBA and undergrad students would design and execute an investment portfolio of a fictional university. And then the goal is to have investments that are not only financially profitable, but also have a positive impact on the environment as well. And this could be things like de-investment from fossil fuels and creating more like investments in renewable energy, for example. And then obviously this was badly interrupted with the coronavirus pandemic. Many of the groups did not get to present all their ideas about the challenge and everything. So we're still trying to talk to various participants and get their thoughts and approaches on sustainable investment, so that all their thoughts and efforts thinking about this portfolio challenge don't necessarily go to waste, whereas we can still, learn from them. Next slide.
Great. So now we can go over kind of the research approach that we took for this project. Before we actually did any of the interviews at all, kind of what we have on the slide, the first semester was kind of dedicated to doing lots of like archival research. So just looking online and trying to break down this pretty technical world of climate finance into digestible pieces that we could understand, and then we could translate to create content on both the website as well as the social media, which I'll go on to in the next slide for other people to understand as well. But after the first semester, once we felt like we had a pretty strong grounding in climate finance and some of the basic concepts in that, we wanted to develop resources that kind of matched our two goals. So one of the goals was to document the TIPC challenge and kind of understand why so many people were interested in this phenomenon of impact investing in climate finance and what made them want to get involved. And that has kind of manifested itself in doing stakeholder interviews with both climate activists as well as TIPC participants in the competition. And then the second kind of goal of the entire project was to develop resources that could be used by anyone who's just generally interested in climate finance. And so that's where we did the expert interviews and are developing kind of content around that will eventually be published on both the website as well as our social media. And then could we go to the next slide, please? And so in terms of the output of our project, there are two main things. So the first is a website. It's live now and it's linked on the PPEH website. If you go in there and click under the experiments tab, you'll be able to find it. But it contains right now kind of some contextual information on the challenge, as well as a lexicon that we've built out on some basic terms in climate finance. And it's going to eventually house a lot of the blogs that we publish. And then the second piece of that is our social media. So shameless plug, definitely follow it if you're active on Twitter or Instagram. But we've been sharing lots of pieces of the lexicon as well as updates on the project through those streams. And then next slide. And so that's basically it on our project. So that's our picture with the rest of the climate finance public research interns. And we want to thank Bethany for being a great point person. She's been helping us through the entire project from the very beginning, as well as Tyler, who's been a great contact at TIPC and the Word Social Impact Initiative. So if time permits, we'd love to take any questions anyone might have.
Yeah, so let's take the first question that appears, if it appears soon. Otherwise, we would have to move on. We're still a little bit behind schedule. Okay. I'm not seeing any questions yet. How about we get back to any questions near the end in the wrap-up time so we have time for all the presentations. Thank you, everyone. So the next project is bin pairing and waste diversion project, which will be introduced by Danielle Cavalcanto of the Penn School of Medicine.
Me?
We can hear you.
Okay. Hello, my name is Danielle Cavalcanto. I'm with the design coordinator for the Perelman School of Medicine. We partnered with Rochelle and Calais. Rochelle is studying economics in Wharton. Sorry, is this backfeeding for everyone? Can you still hear me?
We can still hear you.
Okay, sorry, it was like double. Economics in Wharton and in international studies. Calais is studying chemistry with a minor in Hispanic studies. Over the past year, Rochelle and Calais, with the help of Housekeeping, have looked at the waste and recycling contamination rates in the clinical research building. This building had either very outdated signage or no signage at all, and the bins were kind of located all over the place. The audits were conducted on a twice weekly basis for 2 months on the 3rd and 4th floor of the building. Once data was collected, we then did a rollout of updated signage with standardized bin and recycling locations. And after a week of implementation, we did a second round of twice weekly audits on the 3rd and 4th floor for 2 months in the hopes that we have decrease in contamination found in the trash and recycling stream due to the updated signage with the correct information and the bins also being in standardized locations. I look forward to seeing the results.
Okay. Thank you, Danielle, for that. My name is Rochelle.
Hi, I'm Calais.
Hello. Okay, so as Danielle mentioned, the main purpose of our project was to improve waste diversion in the clinical research building of the Penn School of Medicine, and we were doing this by putting up new signs above the bins. We could go to the next slide. Next slide, please. So we decided to sample 2 floors, floors 3 and 4, and the main reason for this was that sides 3A and 4B had no signs, and sides 3B and 4A had very old signs, as you can see in the picture. And we were trying to evaluate like the effects of the new signage for the floors that had no signs and the floors that had signs. And we performed trash audits on the waste material from these floors to understand the current diversion and contamination rates. And then after the new signage, as Danielle mentioned, we performed more trash audits to analyze the impact on diversion and contamination rates, the impact of the new signage. We could go to the next slide. So just a sort of timeline for our project. We initially did trash audits once a week together, but then we realized we wouldn't have enough data doing this, so we transitioned in the second month to doing audits twice a week separately. So I would go one day and Claire would go the next day, but Danielle would be present in both trash audits. And then early this year, on early February, we rolled out the new signage. And then just immediately after, we took trash audits again with the new signage, and we just stopped taking trash audits the week before spring break. If we could go to the next slide. So typically, in a trash audit, Kale and I would be excited to sort out the trash. So we'd pick the bags and then we'd sort out the trash, meaning we'd take recyclables out of the trash and then trash that wasn't recyclables. And then we would weigh the recyclables that were in trash, and then we'd weigh the trash that were in recyclables. And then the third weighing would be recyclables that were in recyclables, and the fourth time would be trash that was in trash. So we did this before the new signage and after the new signage, and now Kale is going to talk about the data we obtained. If you could go to the next slide.
Yeah, so as Rochelle said, after our preliminary audit in November and December, Danielle put up these new signs, and you can see that they're significantly more detailed than the old signs were. They include a lot more pictures, and they even include what is not recyclable or disposable to mitigate common misconceptions. And you can go to the next slide. So we recognize there's not as much data as we anticipated having. We plan to continue going well into the middle of March. So it could have been slightly different, but this is the data that we have. So we ran an analysis with 5 different metrics, some of which were the same as the composting group used. So some of those are similar, but we compared our data from last semester to this semester. And due to time constraints, I'll just briefly explain the first 3 and go into detail on the last 2. But so this is the diversion rate, which is the amount of material that wound up in recycling and would have gone to the recycling firm before our intervention. You can go to the next slide. And so this is the real recycling rate. It's the amount of recyclables that actually ended up in recycling over all the material. And the potential recycling rate is all of the recycling, regardless of location, over all the materials. So recycling that was in trash and recycling that was in recycling. And you can go to the next slide, Natalie. And so this is the capture rate. So it's the amount of recycling that actually ended up in recycling over all of the recyclables. You can see it's generally a pretty good amount, like usually above 50%. The data doesn't seem to be super conclusive. Like it does depend on the floor and the side of the floor. For 3A, we saw no significant change with the new signs. 3B, we saw a pretty significant increase. 4A, there was a slight decrease. And 4B, there was another increase. And I think one thing to take away from this one is it's difficult to improve the capture rate because with just signage, because once you reach a ceiling of people who are being conscientious enough to look at signs and like consider their own waste habits, from there it's difficult to get past the ambiguity of like what is recyclable, even when people are caring about that. Sometimes it's just not clear. And we can go to the next slide. And so this is the contamination rate, the percentage of material in recycling that actually belonged in the trash. And these numbers were pretty good, usually really low, most below 15%. And But same thing as the capture rate, it really did depend on the floor. But it did make me think that the problem, like comparing the decently high capture rate to the low contamination rate, made me think that the problem is people not knowing that something is in fact recyclable, rather than people throwing trash in the recycling. So you can go to the next slide.
So more about some qualitative data. We noticed because these bins were located next to break rooms, most of the data came from like food wrappings, coffee cups, plastic knives and forks. So majority of the, as I said, contamination came from these coffee cups, napkins, plastic forks, and knives. And sometimes it was hard to tell when we were working with Danielle and Calais what is really recyclable, whether something is recyclable or not, and would have to ask Elizabeth at some point. And also, personally, I realized that something can be recyclable, but its soil level could make it end up in trash. So this is probably something people could think about when they're trashing recyclables, the soil level of the recyclables. We could go to the next slide.
So my main takeaway was just really the gray area that exists in recycling when you're just not sure if something is recyclable depending on how big it is and how flexible it is. Like some people might put something in the trash because they think it's too stiff when it really belongs in the recycling. And it also has to do with the profitability, how much the recycling firm will want to buy these recyclables and how much they'll profit from it. And I think it also, this project emphasized for me that reducing and reusing does come before recycling just because there is so much ambiguity in recycling. And also, I was considering some potential further improvements to the signage. Richard, one of the eco-rep coordinators, suggested putting physical objects on some of the bins because we did see the same objects contaminating the trash usually. Like we saw plastic forks and knives or in the recycling, and we saw coffee cups. Or sorry, we saw plastic forks and knives in the trash when they're really recyclable, and we saw coffee cups in the recycling when they're really trash. So just emphasizing the objects that we see over and over again.
And additionally, as Calais said, there's a maximum or a cap someone can reach for people who actually look at recycling bins. So maybe a further study or awareness campaign can be sent out to people for them to actually look at the bins, and the survey can probably ask people whether they saw the bins or they saw the signs over the bins, and this could give us or give someone a sense of how many people actually conscious when they're throwing trash and they actually look at the sign. So this is something that could be furthered with this project, that an extra awareness campaign can be conducted. And I'd like to thank Danielle and Housekeeping in absentia for working with us, and we will take questions.
Hello. We'll take questions in the group chat. Unfortunately, we're running really far behind our schedules, so feel free to put it in the chat, and we're going to move on to our next group. Thank you, Calais and Rochelle. Now we have the Bird Strikes team, which will be introduced by Chloe Serwinka.
Thanks, Andy. Hi, everyone. My name is Chloe Serwinka, and I work as a landscape planner at FRES, and I'm also a graduate of Penn's Master of Environmental Studies program, where I studied birds as ecological indicators on Penn's campus. And we're joined here by Joe Durrance, who works in IT support for the School of Medicine and is also an MES graduate, where he completed his research on mitigating bird window collisions on campus. And I'm happy to introduce our student eco-rep team. So we have Avni Limdi, who is a junior studying systems engineering with a minor in sustainability and environmental management. And we also have Ryan Lamb, who is a sophomore studying chemical and biomolecular engineering. And they spent the last school year working on a bird strike mitigation and awareness program. So scientists estimate that 1 billion birds are killed by window collisions in the US every year, and birds are critical to ecology and human survival. So this project aimed to reduce the number of birds killed on campus and increase awareness of the issue. And Ryan and Avni have done an incredible job collecting critical bird strike data on campus, researching best practices, creating partnerships, engaging the Penn community, and helping create bird-friendly guidelines that will help move the needle and make Penn a leader in ecological design. And I'll hand it off to Ryan and Avni, and thanks so much.
All right. So for those of you who don't know, Penn Crushes is a Facebook group for Penn students that allows students to anonymously voice thoughts, opinions, and concerns about all aspects of campus culture. So as you can see here, in November, the quantity of dead birds noticed had garnered quite a bit of attention, especially in Lauder College House. So that's just a little joke right there. But so next slide.
Okay, so before we explain some of our work, we just wanted to provide some context on the problem in general. So glass is invisible to birds, and to some degree, it's also invisible to humans, but fortunately, we don't die on the first time we run into glass, and we instead kind of get the chance to learn what glass is and how to not run into it every time we see it. Birds, on the other hand, they often die because of the impact of flying quickly into glass. And there are several other factors that may lead to a bird flying into glass in the first place, and we'll touch upon those later. But overall, the increased building infrastructure by just people has led to an extreme decline in bird populations all over the world, like Chloe mentioned earlier. So we have here that the BBC reported that bird population in the US and Canada has reduced by 3 billion in less than 50 years, which is pretty insane. And even at Penn, we can see that this is a problem, and we can also see some of the causes of the problem. Through conversations with various campus stakeholders and our project collaborators at FRES, we learned about bird strike hotspots like the Lauder College House, the PCPSE building, Van Pelt, and many more. So our project aimed to track bird strikes and to determine if these are hotspots, and then to conduct an awareness campaign for Penn affiliates, including students, housekeeping teams, building managers, and more. Next slide.
Awesome. So in order to actually collect the data about the bird strikes on campus, we had a bit of a standardized methodology. So we walked around the Perelman Center for Political Science and Economics, the Annenberg Public Policy Center, and Lauder College House every weekday morning in the fall semester to look for birds. And here's a graph of the 19 birds on the left that we were able to physically collect. So as you can see, most of the time we didn't actually find anything, which is like a good thing because that means birds aren't dying. But for a period there between mid-October and early November, we did find quite a number of birds. And the special thing about that time period is that it coincides very well with the fall migration pattern of some species of birds, which means that we know that the birds that are actually hitting the windows and falling down are mostly migratory birds from elsewhere. And then beyond this, though, we also know that there were a lot more birds that died than we were able to pick up. And this graph only shows the birds that we actually collected. One thing that limited our collection was that we didn't collect the birds until around 9 a.m. every day, which is a few hours after we know that groundskeepers are on campus and cleaning everything up. So we probably missed out on a lot of the birds that were already cleaned up from that. And then a second problem that we have is that some birds are actually physically inaccessible. So as you can see on the bottom right, Van Pelt Library is actually a really bright building at light, and that bright light attracts a lot of birds to fly into the windows. And so, so once the birds fly into the windows and die, they fall into a ledge that's actually inaccessible to the public. So as you can see in the top right with the ledges pointed out. And so if they fall into those ledges, we can't actually get to them and pick them up. We are able to record that data through iNaturalist, however, by taking birds from taking photos from a little bit of a distance, and then we upload those photos to iNaturalist. So if you could go to the next slide. So here are just some of the most numerous birds that we were able to record on iNaturalist, just to give you an idea about what they actually look like. So here's the statistic to remember. We recorded over 50 bird strikes to iNaturalist on the Penn Bird Strikes iNaturalist page just over the fall semester, over 50. Next slide. So here's a map of all the documented bird strikes at Penn from the iNaturalist page. And just to reiterate, iNaturalist is an application that you can download onto your smartphone that allows you to take pictures of a bird strike and then upload it to a database. And then it records the GPS coordinates of the bird strike and then generates a map based on that data. And that map is what you see here. So as you can see, sometimes the recorded strikes happen in clusters around certain buildings, such as the ones shown around Van Pelt Library and Lauder College House in the red circles. Initially, when the data had been more sparse, we found clusters and planned to regularly walk on routes around the PCPSE building, Annenberg Public Policy Center building, and Lauder College House. However, now the two clusters outlined in red are the most prominent ones to us. And so at Lauder College House, over this past semester or two, we've been working on establishing plans to install a window decal that helps to mitigate the frequency of bird strikes. So now that Lauder College House has kind of been taken care of a little bit, we suggest that Van Pelt Library be the next building of interest. Overall though, the biggest problem that we've been tackling this year is expanding our network of people who are actually uploading to iNaturalist. So with more data points, we can better determine where specifically we should focus our efforts. So to address this, we've been in contact with various building managers across campus and the housekeeping staff with Marina previously. And so they've all been helping us in gathering data, but it'd still be really useful to get many more people on this project, especially students. Next slide.
Yeah, so now I'm just going to go briefly into like our spring semester plans that were unfortunately cut short. So we started to ramp up an awareness campaign, which is going to be tabling at Locust outside of Lauder College House to share some information about how students and just people at Penn can help us in our collection efforts and also make changes to their living spaces to make them more bird friendly. Some of the tips that we shared are on the slide, included utilizing the hotline email that we created. And then we give some tips on how to make your home apartment room or more bird friendly. And like Ryan mentioned, we would talk about downloading iNaturalist and joining the Penn Bird Strikes project to upload images of birds that were found. Another major part of the spring semester that we would have liked to do is monitoring the effectiveness and utilization of the hotline we set up. We would want to see if there were any ways to improve the system to alleviate challenges housekeeping encountered. And in general, we would want to see how many students, faculty, and others actually sent emails to the hotline. Also, Frez actually arranged the installation of decals on part of the Lauder College House courtyard. So we would be closely monitoring the statistics on iNaturalist to see if the bird strikes at Lauder College House decreased because of the decals at all. Next slide. And so then some of our conclusions and future suggestions is that, like, in general, this project has so many venues for further development. But the main points to emphasize are that we really need increased data collection of bird strikes at Penn and increased mitigation. It's really hard to convince like the management to kind of take action because these decals are super expensive. But if the data collection is increased through collaborating with students, housekeeping, etc., then we'd be able to find where the hotspots are and then pitch to kind of campus affiliates that, hey, like maybe you really should install these decals on the building. And in general, we also want there to be standards implemented to make sure that any new buildings that are created are bird friendly, so that we have to avoid this whole process of collecting birds and like pitching and finding out whether something is a hotspot or not. Next slide. So we just kind of, oh yeah, next slide. Sorry, yeah, okay, thanks. So yeah, we just wanted to wrap up the presentation, just thanking all of these people that we mentioned. We went with tons of people who are really passionate about this. And we didn't add them to the slide, but we also want to thank the Sustainability Office, especially Natalie, Richard, and Andy for helping us throughout the year. And I don't know if we're taking questions, but we'll definitely answer them when we get them.
Okay, thank you guys. So we're not going to take questions right now. We'll answer questions at the end. Thank you so much for your presentation, and we're going to move on to our final group. And to introduce that final group, we have Diana Alberti to talk about the nursing simulation lab.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Diana Alberti. I am the Simulation Operations Manager at the Helene Fold Pavilion for Innovative Learning and Simulation, also known as the Nursing Sim Lab. I'm going to introduce our project, Nursing, a Real Look into Recycling in the Simulated Healthcare Environment. Our project partners included me, Lucia DiNapoli, Assistant Dean, Office of the Dean, and Joe Gomez, Senior Building Administrator and Chair of the Sustainability Committee. And our two awesome student eco reps were Angelique Agudo, who's a nursing major with a minor in global health, class of 21, and Chris Kwok, class of 22, School of Arts and Sciences, exploring a major in environmental sciences. The purpose of this project was to write a green fund application for a consultant to support the burgeoning greening of the Helene Fold Pavilion, which included 4 goals. The first goal was to attain peer institution comparison. Second, to attain local healthcare partners comparison. Third, to observe simulation activities. And fourth was to actually write the green fund application. And I will let our eco reps tell you the rest.
Hi guys, so as Diana mentioned, I'm Angelique.
And I'm Chris.
Yeah, and together we worked on the Nursing Simulation Lab recycling project this past year.
Just so to start off the presentation, we wanted to just go over what we were going to talk about. So we're going to introduce the problem, how we collected the data, and then the actual steps towards writing the green fund application. So the next slide, please.
So I'm just going to go over what is a simulation lab. So the simulation lab provides students with hands-on clinical experience. Specifically, students get immersive educational experiences that help bridge the gap between classroom learning and real-world education. They're able to gain vital exposure to the nursing field in a safe and controlled environment through skills and clinical scenarios. Next slide, please. So here are just some pictures of Penn's simulation lab. As you can see, there are various ways to practice nursing skills, especially with the use of mannequins.
So on the next slide, we have the problem, which is that every day there are 50 to 100 gallons of trash taken from the simulation labs. So most rooms in the sim labs contain 1 trash bin and 1 recycling bin, but there's often like contamination or people not knowing what goes where. And we determined that recycling and reuse of equipment will save upwards of $7,000 to $15,000 annually on expected savings or like single-use medical equipment. Next slide, please. So this slide shows our steps towards writing the green fund application. So the first step was to look at online reports, so reading online reports from other institutions and other websites. Then we went in to do SimLab observations, which were watching the practicals in real time. And then we also contacted peer institutions, such as other nursing schools and hospitals, to ask for their sustainable strategies.
And then after that, we were able to receive a list of potential consultants from our project partners. We ended up choosing a consultant, and then we reached out regarding estimated costs for bringing in this sustainability consultant into our nursing lab. And then with that information, you're then able to complete the green fund application. And then actually just this past week, our green fund application was approved or accepted. Next slide, please.
So we're just going to go in depth on what we saw during the SimLab observations. So we went in at different times, but when I went in, they were operating on pigs. They were using chest tubes and syringes, so we had multiple groups with disposable plastic kits. And in these sim labs, there are easy access to the recycling bins, but some observations that I made was that under examination and observation conditions, I don't know that recycling is the top priority for the students, and there might be other ways that we can improve the sustainability culture.
And then, yeah, as a nursing student, I've been able to witness firsthand the waste that occurs from materials used in the simulation lab. oftentimes when we practice skills, we end up throwing the materials used away, as it is hard to repackage or properly recycle due to the certain types of plastic that come about from like these IV bags and tubing. Next slide, please. And then here are just some examples of materials that are commonly used in the simulation lab.
Next slide, please. So now we're just going to talk about the peer institutions that we contacted. So on the screen, we have a bunch of schools that we reached out to through email. And 2 schools in particular, Emory University and Yale, were able to give us some good information. I read an online report from Emory, and it basically just talked about how, in addition to efficient internal recycling customs, partnering with external programs and institutions are more beneficial. And then Yale, we actually had a FaceTime with the Yale Sim Lab operations manager, who actually sent us a video and detailed specific reuse strategies, which will be discussed on the next slide.
Next slide, please. Okay. So here, the picture on the right is the simulations manager at Yale. So she just shared a couple of techniques that they use in order to reuse nursing equipment that are used in the simulation lab. So for example, they're able to repackage IV bags by refilling the IV bag with water using a syringe, and then they're able to seal that with parafilm, which they did mention you can buy on Amazon. Similarly, reusing medication bottles consists of filling up the bottles with Kool-Aid mix. In that way, this kind of acts as like a medication that you can use for reconstitution. And then on the bottom, they're able to reuse primary IV tubes, which is actually what's shown on the picture on the right. They do this by draining the IV tubes and then hanging it to dry for a few days. And then they save the caps in order to recap these IV tubes. And then just repackaging materials in general, they're able to do that by using a plastic sealer and cellophane, as well as crimpers for caps. And in that way, you're able to repackage materials as if it's like a new package instead of buying it. Next slide, please.
So this is just a quick visual recapping some institutions that we contacted and which employ what type of sustainability practices. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick visual looking at the costs and the benefits. So we estimated that we could save $15,000 annually from reuse and recycling. We have the consultant budget from iSpring, which is $1,480. And then costs with no intervention. So this range was calculated based on price per ton of trash and recycling that the university pays. But this is an optimistic figure as it only accounts for school days as it doesn't account for school days as well as recycling metrics. So next slide, please.
So I just want to go over upcoming goals. So since we did get our green fund approved, our next step is to schedule a date for the consultant to conduct a waste audit in the Penn Nursing Simulation Lab, which we hope can take place in the fall semester. Then after they're able to conduct this waste audit, we as eco reps or the Penn Nursing faculty will have a meeting with the consultant so that she can go over what we can do to promote sustainability in the simulation lab. And then she's going to provide Penn Nursing with a report on like advice on what to do. And then we're expecting that the reporting from this Green Fund will inform a new Green Fund application for actions based on the consultant's report.
Next slide, please. That's actually the end of our presentation. We'd just like to thank Diana, Joe, and Lucia for helping us with this process, and yeah, the Sim Labs.
Yeah, and also thank you to Andy, Richard, and Natalie for helping us out throughout the year.
All right. Thank you, Angelique and Chris. That was a great presentation. So we're going to now move on to some of the questions that we either answered in the chat or that have yet to be answered. Feel free to turn on your mic if you have an answer to a question. We'll finish up in maybe 5 to 7 more minutes, and then Natalie will wrap up. So one question that I thought was really cool, and Ryan already answered, but I feel like it would be interesting for everyone to hear, is the questions about how inventions such as decals could benefit birds, and also have other positive impacts. So Ryan, if you want to cover that, please take it away.
Yeah, so I kind of put the text in the chat box, but basically, certain measures like putting up curtains over windows has a twofold benefit. So one, it makes the window visible to birds so they don't fly into the window because they can't see through it anymore. And also curtains help prevent sunlight getting in during summer months. So that can help with cooling costs, right? And conversely, in the winter, it also acts like a piece of insulation that helps decrease warming costs. And then it also mentioned how how these interventions could help improve occupancy satisfaction. So we know at Lauder College House, one of the reasons why that building was especially excited to help get this mitigation plan on the way is that a couple of the residents had actually complained, or the parents of the residents there had complained that why are there so many dead birds in our courtyard? So that helped to prompt a bit of action on Penn's part. And then finally, yeah, it is part of the LEED building clause, the LEED specification to make buildings if a building is more bird friendly, they do get some LEED credits for that.
Okay. Awesome, Ryan. It's a really cool concept, and if people want to look that up, there's a couple really cool websites that we can post about it. So the next thing that I think we can cover, if the lichen team is still around, is how quickly do lichen respond to air quality? Is this a snapshot or a historical data? We're just kind of curious about how it influences with a time factor. So if anyone from the lichen group could just speak up.
Yeah, so I think it would definitely depend on the species, because different species thrive in different environments and also just have different growth periods. So the species themselves can be indicative of of how good or bad the air quality is, but again, kind of the response time would just depend per species.
Yeah, I can add to that. And just in generally though, it's a good rule of thumb to assume that lichen are at least semi-resistant, a lot of them. I answered this question more detailed in the little Q&A box, but lichen species can essentially just last throughout the entire year. Their morphology doesn't vary with the seasons. So you could technically capture data on them and how they're changing to air quality changes throughout the year, which is really convenient.
Since we're on lichen, one quick fun question was, did anyone of the lichen group have a favorite type of lichen?
Oh yeah, I think I answered that one in the chat box. I can't really pronounce it, but it's Flavoparmelia carpella. But I really like that one just because it's really distinct in that it's a yellow-green color and it's super bright and really easily identifiable. And it's a foliose type of lichen, so it's more of a leafy one.
Yeah, mine really quickly was it has a really funny common name. It's called tree lungwort. It's a European lichen species, and it's this really rich, beautiful green color. But it's been slowly becoming more endangered as time passes, which kind of sucks.
Thank you. So moving on to a different group, Marina. So one of the questions that came in, and I'm curious to hear about your perspective on it, was the idea of what specific sustainability practices do you recommend for the housekeepers?
Yeah, so there were a couple different things that we talked about in our presentation. I think Joe mentioned a couple of these in his answer in the chat, but one of them was the move from what's called a ready-to-use chemical dispensing system to ready-to-dispense. So basically that means going from individual bottles that are used and then thrown out to a system where bottles can be reused and refilled with a concentrate mixture. So that creates a lot less waste as well as less waste for shipping and delivering all those containers to campus. We also talked about this company called Revolution Bag, which creates trash bags that are almost 100% recycled material, and those are being used all around campus. And then finally, we talked about the new resilient floor finish that is being used because it doesn't have corrosive or harsh chemicals, and it only uses water for daily maintenance. So it is a lot more sustainable in that way as well.
We're going to have to hire her. That was really good.
Thankfully, I believe this is being recorded, so we can just listen to that later. Thank you, everyone. I think we're reaching kind of the end of the question time period. Please feel free to put any questions in the chat box or just to contact us with any of these sites via our website, our email, our Facebook group, our Twitter, our Instagram, and we'll follow up with any questions. So to kind of conclude it, we'll have my boss, Natalie Walker, finish it off. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for taking the time to learn from the student Iker reps and their project partners today. I want to thank a few people, particularly the student Iker reps, for their dedication in making a positive impact on Penn's campus. I also want to thank the student Iker rep coordinators, Andy and Richard, for their support in organizing the program and providing innovative solutions to push each group's project forward. The Iker rep project partners, all of your guidance and mentorship over the past academic year has really supported this group. And I want to thank the Division of Facilities and Real Estate Services for their support of this program. This truly would not be possible without all of your support. And I encourage everybody on this call to consider what you've learned from the student stories today and how you might use our campus as a living lab as well. If you have ideas for future projects, please don't hesitate to reach out to the Sustainability Office using the contact information on the screen. And for any unanswered questions, we've compiled a list and we'll follow up if we were not able to answer them within a few days. So thank you all for taking the time to hear the student Iker rep stories today, and have a wonderful weekend.